Welcome everyone. I'm Ed Riefenstahl, and I have the honor of moderating this panel. And I'm going to have each of our guests introduce themselves, and we'll start, I guess, with Dan. Would you go first, please?
Of course. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Mcguire. I'm a shareholder with Polsinelli, an AmLaw 100 law firm. We have a really strong presence here in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. I'm a trial lawyer and I'm a commercial litigator who helps individuals and businesses resolve business disputes. And my practice focused primarily on representing clients in the commercial real estate, technology, healthcare, and construction industries. And I specialize in handling disputes involving commercial leases, licensing agreements, vendor and supply agreements, purchase agreements, as well as disputes involving fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, tortious interference, trade secrets, and other business disputes like that. So very happy to be here to provide some insight into business strategy coming out of the pandemic.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. Ashford, would you go next, please?
Yes, sir. I'm Ashford Chancellor. I'm the practice manager for the North Texas region of VCFO. We're a financial consulting firm that offers fractional CFO, controller, HR, and recruiting solutions to small to medium-sized businesses. We have for 25 years and have handled over 4,000 clients during that time in a variety of industries. Thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Ashford. Ken, would you go next, please?
Yeah, I'm Kenneth Crotchfor. I'm the general manager of the Dallas office for Pierpont Communications. We are the largest independently owned PR firm in the state of Texas. Our clients are on a national and international basis, though. We don't really focus on one particular vertical industry. Our clients are across many. We're basically an outsourced marketing and PR resource for our clients. And I love hearing stories like Alex earlier from Door, validating the power of PR, having that front page article and what it did to his business. So I'm looking forward to this discussion today and talking about the impact of COVID and what you should be doing on the PR marketing front.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ken. So as you gathered, we have individuals on the panel that have exceptional backgrounds and experiences in the legal arena, the financial arena, and also the marketing, communications, and public relations arena. So what I thought I would do would be to kick it off by asking each of our panelists one question, and then pause and open it up for any other questions we would have from the other individuals joining us today. And I hope that we'll have just a good in-depth conversation as our time progresses here. So let me start in a little bit of reverse order. Ken, given the impact of COVID-19 during most of 2020 and probably continuing a few months into 2021, hopefully as few months as possible, what should companies be focusing on right now from a marketing, sales / communications perspective?
The simple answer is more. You know, it's not the time to sit back and wait and see what happens with COVID and the economy and your working environment. That passive approach is probably what a lot of your competitors are doing. And it's not a way to come out of this faster. And it's not a way to come out of this on top of your competitors. In fact, to the contrary, it's time to double down. And so, you know, in the spirit of eating our own dog food, as they say, that's exactly what we did for our business starting in March. We doubled our spending on our digital campaigns, and it's why we are flat or above. You know, we were on track to have a 4th record year, and we just might make that. But even flat during this time would be quite an achievement, given what our competitors, they're suffering. Everyone's cut back on sales and PR and marketing support at a time when they probably shouldn't. So think about this. I would say that spending $1 today will get you what it would take $3 to spend in the normalized economy when it comes to marketing. Your dollar goes further, especially now that the election is behind us. That certainly put a constraint on some traditional and some digital marketing and spending, and a lot of noise in the marketplace you may not have wanted to compete against. But what I will tell you is, for the remainder of fourth quarter and going into first quarter, go out there, have a good, cohesive campaign, a clear call to action. And, everything I'm saying, I'll add the caveat that the industry you're in plays some bearing on what I'm saying, right? So there are verticals that are booming because of COVID, and booming, that's a large term. There's some that are holding their own. I would say ours is holding its own. And there's some that are suffering. I mean, if you're in hospitality, I'm not telling you to go out and spend what money you have to keep the doors open, on marketing. But what I am saying is, put some thoughtfulness behind it. Don't think, well, we'll figure out marketing when the market comes back. Statistics show that 50% of B2B, business to business buyers are still buying. And compare that to consumer spending, which is down 30%. And so companies are still investing. They're investing in technology. They're investing in infrastructure. And this is the time to get your house in order. You have a lot of people with a lot of time between now and the holidays to figure things out. And if your marketing team and your sales team aren't figuring out how to message coming out of this, and that's again what Alex talked about, when he changed the messaging approach of his business is when he saw an inflection point. So I have a few suggestions, and I'll keep it short because I don't want to monopolize, but there are tactics that are scalable and don't cost a lot. This is the time to refresh your sales to funnel, to understand who you're going after and define what those buyers are and what their pain points are. If you're not using HubSpot or CRM, now's the time to get that in place. Plan a social selling strategy. If you have not polished your LinkedIn and gone through and made connections, this is the time. People have the time to connect with you. When things get busy again, you'll be on the back burner. You won't get answers. And then I guess the final 2 points are, we call it persona-based messaging. You cannot message to everyone the same way. Define who your buyers are, figure out what buckets they fit in, and then come up with messages that resonate with them. And then finally, here's the genuine part of it. Make authentic connections. This is a time to pick up a phone for someone that's been a client or a good referral source and just have a conversation. Don't try to sell them. Find out what's going on in their world and be genuine. Have a genuine relationship and promote that, because they're getting plenty of calls from vendors and people trying to sell to them. But be heartfelt. Make sure you have a good, solid relationship, and they're going to remember you first when they come out of this. Okay.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. Very good tips there for all of us to be thinking about. So Ashford, we heard from our breakfast keynoter. I'm going back to my notes here. So 7 out of 10 businesses, did he say, are, I guess, on the downside or just below where they would normally be. And 50% of those, I think he said, were not profitable. So given that, how do companies, or how should companies evaluate their liquidity in this current environment that we're all working our way through?
Thanks, Ed. And yes, liquidity. One of the tenets of American capitalism has been invest for growth. We've all worked for companies where the majority of profit is invested into expanding current infrastructure, creating future markets. You're investing in innovation, you're investing in people. And a lot of times the bottom line is the least of that. So one of the things that the pandemic has exposed is the incredible lack of liquidity among certain segments of corporate America. And as we heard in this morning it's gradually, there's a consensus, I think, emerging among a lot of economists and business analysts about what they call the K recovery, the K-shaped recovery. And the upper slope of that K is, technology companies that deal with business sectors that are propelled by the pandemic, such as PPE, cleaning equipment, things like that. And then on the downslope, there's the hospitality, travel, entertainment that are going to take a long time to recover. So I'm going to talk about both of those slopes and how the pandemic has affected it. I'm going to start off, Ed, like you said, with the companies that were the most damaged.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said before, liquidity was a weak point that the pandemic collapse exposed. And one of the things that has emerged, and I'm going to actually read from this quote that I found from Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Federal Reserve. And as he was talking about naming his chief concerns as the world tries to recover from COVID, and he was speaking on a European Central Bank panel. And he said, one of the things he talked about was that there's a risk that I'm just going to read it. There's a risk that there's some longer run damage to the productive capacity of the economy and to people's lives who have been disrupted by the pandemic. He said it's women who are not by choice out of the labor market. It's kids who are not getting the education they should be getting. And it's small businesses with generations of intellectual capital that is being destroyed. And I want to focus for the purposes of this on that last statement. It's businesses with generations of intellectual capital that are being destroyed. And, one of the things that I was noticing, I happened to pass through a section of Dallas not too long ago where there was a lot of small businesses that looked like they were permanently shuttered. And it was a very grim landscape. And so while we have been conditioned to grow, one of the things that we have not taken into account is liquidity and its and sustainability as a foundation of value. A lot of businesses that didn't have enough liquidity have been destroyed. And so you can invest in growth all you want, but when these times come and as hundreds of thousands of small businesses disappeared, we need to keep that in mind. And I want to talk about 3 examples that speak to this, right? Actually 2 that I've got. One is a friend of mine who's in marketing. She's not a finance person at all. And when the pandemic hit and the shutdown occurred and businesses went into a panic and many closed pretty quickly, a lot of them had struggled. She said, well, why are we as individuals, our financial best practice for us and our families need to have 6 months of savings on hand in case we lose our jobs, we can pay our bills. But a lot of companies, after 3 or 4 weeks, are going out of business. And I was like, oh, that's a great point. That's an excellent point. And then on the other side, I was listening to a podcast. The host was in Washington, D.C., and he had a restaurant owner on one of his podcasts. And this restaurant owner owned 3 restaurants in the D.C. area. And they'd been in business for a long time. And he was talking about how he was able to pay his 140 employees, even though his restaurants were shut down, 140 employees for 14 straight weeks until the shutdown was lifted without any outside assistance. So you look at, his being in the restaurant industry, the one that was the hardest hit, he had prepared for this. He was able to sustain his decades-long business because he had prepared for this. And so one of the things and I'm gonna come back to this in later on because I don't want to go on too long, but I'm gonna talk about it in a further section about how businesses can look at this in order to prepare themselves to have the appropriate liquidity.
Yeah, that's great, Ashford. Okay, so Dan, so I can think of a few, but what are some of the legal issues that you see are going to be implicating small businesses as we work through and come out of this pandemic?
Thanks, Ed. Well, we're obviously in a situation where people are thinking about just the actual financial health their companies and their livelihoods. And I don't blame anybody for that at all, because that's what we all been doing. But I think we're at that time where people do see at least maybe a light at the end of the tunnel with the potential vaccine coming up. But I think that even with that, businesses as part of this need to think through future legal issues that are going to come up. So I can think of at least 4 kind of broad categories that at least my clients are talking to me about and talking to my partners about. The first, I think, is pretty obvious. Actually, it's employment-related issues. You obviously have, and I know, certain businesses obviously have been handling some of these questions already for the past 6 to 8 months, and I certainly get that. But I think that going forward, it's not going to go away. And so some of those employment issues are, compliance with CDC guidelines, making sure to minimize employee exposure to the coronavirus. I think employee training is a massive issue, not just in terms of specific coronavirus issues, but also this has been a very unprecedented time, I think, in lack of general engagement. And I know we have one of our breakouts here just a little earlier about employee engagement, and I was able to pop in on that for just a little bit. But it's just my general understanding. I think a lot of businesses are not doing very well with connecting with their employees as much as they normally do. And inevitably, as part of that, when you're disengaged from your employees end up doing things that either you may not know about, or that, or even if you do know, are not really the right thing to do. And so employee training and engagement in that concept creates legal risk, because when they're, kind of acting outside of the ordinary scope of what they ordinarily would do in a traditional office environment, I think you have a lot of risks there. Obviously, telework and, leave policies are going to be important. And then, we don't want to talk about this, but there are obviously, kind of reduction in force and termination issues that I think are going to come up, because a lot of people have been able to hold on for the past 6 months and try to make ends meet. But, if the current economic circumstances continue, I think a lot of businesses are going to have even tougher choices. So that's kind of one category. The other category that I would, say, which is kind of within my realm specifically, is a lot of how are businesses handling their contracts and their agreements with various customers, partners, suppliers. And that to me is a really big question. And it's already been addressed somewhat, but I think these questions are going to continue. And so the bigger question I get from clients all the time is, I'm in this agreement that is not really feasible, right? This is not really feasible in this environment. What are my options? And ordinarily, a lot of contracts, there's been discussions for months about, and I've provided insight to other panels about force majeure provisions and a legal doctrine called impossibility of performance as defenses in the event that you're not able to perform under your contract. But I think at the end of the day, you can make those arguments in litigation. That's not really, I think, the best business strategy. Even, and this is speaking as a litigator, my goal is to help my clients with their business decisions. And sometimes litigation is not the right approach. And so instead, a lot of times, what I'm encouraging clients to do is to actually just affirmatively and very, forcefully in a lot of ways, ask for a contract modification in some way. Whether that's a commercial lease and some sort of rent abatement, where you add on a period to the end of the lease, if that's important. A lot of landlords are engaging in those types of discussions because they recognize the value proposition is there, because if they were to, let's say they don't modify the agreement, the lease you have, and then let's say they, I understand you're struggling, but you have to pay rent this month. Well, when you don't pay rent, what are their options? Their options are to evict you or sue you for damages. Well, if they decide to take one of those approaches, number one, the suit for damages is costly. If they evict you, there's no new tenants that are coming into these commercial real estate space. I think commercial real estate is going to have a lot of challenges here in the next year or 2 years to try to, obviously modify their business model. So at the end of the day, I think contract modification in any context, whether it's, again, commercial real estate, whether it's supplier agreements, licensing agreements, other things that you're maybe having challenges with, that needs to be an option. The other thing as well, I think actually forward looking, I think companies need to start thinking about proactively having their contracts reviewed by a professional. And obviously, attorneys are one of them in addition to financial advisors. but to make sure that those contracts do take into account things that maybe we didn't take into account before. And that includes, really clear criteria for termination of a contract or for performance metrics under certain contracts. And so I think that that also is an issue. And then the other category that I think is important is, honestly, it's trade secrets and data privacy. I think what's interesting about this is that, again, kind of tied in with this employee concept, with the rise in telework and with the rise in people working from home and the separation of employees who maybe used to work together in an office all the time, I think businesses and employers have to take steps to protect their trade secrets, whether it's customer lists, business plans, sales information. If they are a manufacturer or a distributor of certain products, it could be product data and formulation information. I mean, all of those trade secrets need to be protected. And if you are dealing with either a sales staff who may be working remotely or other employees who are going to have that information readily available, that it's not just confined to your office anymore, or even on a laptop, because people are now printing things out and bringing them home or having them sent to their home. I think trade secret and data privacy is a massive issue that from a legal perspective, businesses are going to have to look forward to. So those are at least three categories that I kind of have identified and I think are going to be important for our listeners here.
And thank you. One of the things that you triggered that came out of the employee engagement session, and I don't know if you were in there for that, but it was a takeaway for me, which is your employee manual, that there's probably been some changes that have happened because of COVID. And so as you go into the new year, to be sure that you ensure that your employees acknowledge these changes, that these additions or modifications to the employee manual, and that they acknowledge it in some way. But also, one of the panelists has said, just to make sure that the new amendments because of COVID don't conflict with anything that might be in the manual. But the key thing for me was just make sure that your employees acknowledge these changes that you may have made because of COVID. So, okay, let's see. Don't have any questions in the chat box thus far, and but I will pause and just open it up to see if anybody wants to convey a question. And we'll go from there. I've got a few other questions, but let's pause for a second. Anybody have something they either want to put into the chat box or just want to ask Dan, Ashford, or Ken?
Actually, I have a question, and Dan, you might be the one that might know about this. I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago that said that some employers might require people to get vaccines, and that there was questions about the legality of that versus employment law. Dan, I don't know if you know that or not, but that's something that's probably coming up for a lot of companies.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Ashford. So I don't specialize in labor and employment law, so I don't know if I can answer that specifically. I do know, so our firm in particular, Polson is nationally recognized as being a healthcare law firm. We represent a tremendous number of healthcare entities, whether it be healthcare providers, pharmacies, obviously everybody within the healthcare space. And I will say that it is being discussed from that perspective, both as a healthcare provider and as a healthcare employer, whether they can, again, force all their frontline healthcare workers in hospitals, kind of dock in the box, 24-hour, emergency rooms,
right,
like that, to make their people get vaccinated. And so I think I think that's yet to be determined. I don't know if anybody's had a real answer, but I know that's being discussed among legal circles within the labor and employment community for sure.
Yeah, a coming cloud on the horizon.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it makes sense. I think most people would say, hey, I mean, these are the types of people who actually, if we're going to have that type of requirement, I'm not sure that certain businesses should force their employees to do that. I mean, there's kind of there's a maybe you can, but you shouldn't. But I think with healthcare, that's obviously the front line. That's
yes,
that's the first group of people who, number one, are going to be asked this question. Number two, are also going to have access to the vaccine, I think, if and when it comes out.
Yeah.
Okay, good. By the way, Dan and Ashford and Ken, let me know if you're good with this. I'm going to put my email in the chat box. So if there's any questions afterwards that don't get answered, send them to me and I will get them out to everybody, as well as provide you with everyone's email, unless that's already somehow available, i.e. Dan and Ashford and Ken's email. And that question you asked, Ashford, came up in a peer advisory board meeting last week that I was involved with. And one of the members sent out, as we were talking, about 5 different links on that subject about the vaccines. And I haven't read any of them yet, but you're right. It's a very hot topic that's developing as we sit here right now.
Yeah.
So Steve, we got a question from Steve. Ken, I think this one is directed to you. I've been talking to a lot of business owners, and a common theme is lead generation. What are some of the best practices that you believe work well in today's world?
Well, so that's a great question. And I have a few simple answers, to be honest. So I teed it up. I said, double down on marketing, right? And PR. And so what are the greatest opportunities for you to do right now? And I mean that greatest in terms of impact, but also in terms of ability to mobilize quickly and do it cost effectively. Lead with digital. Now, again, this applies to the industry you're in, to the people you're targeting, the buyers, the influencers. But if there is a digital aspect to where they get their information, or if there are influencers, could be industry analysts. I'm not talking about financial analysts. I'm talking about industry, trade analysts and so forth. But lead with digital, because it's the best bang for your buck. You can deploy it quickly. The metrics are phenomenal. We usually do A/B testing, and within a week, we know this campaign works great. This one doesn't. So you flip a switch, and unlike traditional advertising where you bought 4 or 5 ads over 5 months, and you learn by the end of the 5th month, wow, that was a really bad campaign. We didn't get any leads out of it. With digital, you're going to know that they're coming there. And again, that also means optimizing your website, because there's a thing out there, there's the paid side and then there's the organic side, without getting too inside baseball. You want to make sure that your website is built in a way, with your messaging and keyword saturation, in a way that it brings people there without you having to pay someone else to bring them there. That's how you want to be on page 1. You should supplement that, and I'll say that for probably 85–90% of the people on this call, is get out there and make sure that you know where people are getting their information and drive them there. Because I'm telling you, there's a lot of inventory. They're pricing it fairly. A campaign, do a test campaign. I'm not saying go out and do some big nationwide push. Test it. And if you like the results in the region, then replicate. It's really easy to scale. The other thing I would say is your social media presence. This is a really good chance to clean up your social media footprint. It's also a good opportunity to look at what your competitors are doing. If you have LinkedIn and 50 followers, but your next biggest competitor has 5,000 followers, what are they doing on their LinkedIn that you're not? And I will tell you, LinkedIn is a good tool, particularly in the B2B world, for making meaningful connections. So these are just all, they're strategic at this level, but then it becomes to deploying the tactics. The next thing is be a thought leader. There's a lot of demand out there right now for content, fresh content. Fresh content benefits you because, one, you're creating it. It could say exactly what you want it to say. It's going to have a clear call to action. Ideally, you want to tease them with a little bit of content, either on LinkedIn or through these paid campaigns, and drive them to your website, which should have a clear call to action relatively quickly afterward. Focus on your niche, define it. The targeted approach will always perform better. And, you may have to dial some things in. Buying habits have changed during COVID. The way people make decisions, the length of time to closing deals has changed. So, get with your sales team so that the marketing and sales team are married at the hip. Finally, this may surprise a lot of you, pick up some charity and community work. Charitable organizations, nonprofits are starving right now. And so whereas in good times, your $5,000 check to the North Texas Food Bank, which had 1,000 people in line over the weekend trying to get food. I know Trish Cunningham that runs that group. She's eternally grateful and will promote you, and you're going to get the best bang for your buck. And let's be honest, we do charitable work because we know it's right, but we want to be recognized as a good corporate citizen. And so what you want is that win-win relationship, whereas we're going to do some good in the community, but we're also going to be recognized for it. And just get out there. And I know it's tougher in COVID times to have the real connections with your communities, but finding those groups, again, those groups should somehow tie back to whatever it is you do, the influencers and decision makers, so that it all works as part of that nice little food chain. So those are just some quick ideas of how to get out there. And I guess so here's the bonus. I mentioned this on the other call earlier, is just get personal. That constant cadence of reaching out to people in a meaningful way, just saying, hey, we can do a virtual lunch, just want to catch up, see how things are going in your life. People want to know that you care. They might be calling you in a month, not to hire you, but to help them find a job. And I will tell you, in my business, the quickest way to get loyal references and loyal clients is to help them get employed. And it's not something I get compensated for in terms of being a headhunter or anything, but it does show that you care, because there's nothing better you can do for somebody than help them find that. And it also gains me favor with the clients or the organizations that they get hired into. So that's a lot. It's, there's 4 or 5 pretty easy things to do. And this is the time to focus on it. Hope that helps.
Good. Ken, by the way, Steve has asked you to connect with him on LinkedIn, and he has put that in the chat box if you want to grab that. And I want to go next to Ashford, but first I have a question that you can help at least me out with, Ken. You said, know where people are getting their information. And help, where would I mean, what are we talking about? I know we're all biased. We all have our own sources, right, of where we get information, but where is there a magic site I can go to?
No, I'm going to be honest. When I'm having those deep, meaningful conversations, I say, hey, I know you got a lot more time to go out there and fish around for either podcast or blogs. Who do you value? Where do you get it from? Is there a publication that you still read? And I know everybody thinks, oh my God, print publications. Well, they've all migrated online. There's always going to be the DBJ, the Real Estate Journal of Dallas, and so forth. And the Dallas Morning News has gotten tougher because you got reporters covering 4 or 5 beats that are not even closely related. So that's good news for us because they rely on our expertise. But the simple answer to that is ask the people, that you feel like represent that cross section. Because ultimately, when I talked about those personas, is it I have this type of buyer at this level, I have this type of buyer and they're CEO and they don't want as much detail. I went through all the Sandler cell system and stuff like that. There's a whole different way to do that, but simply enough is put personas. This is Fred. Fred is the procurement officer. And again, it's relative to what you're trying to sell, but figure out who those 3 or 4 decision makers are and ask them, and if you have to, do a mini focus group. People don't do those like they used to, but say, hey, I got Starbucks cards for 4 of you if you answer these questions for me. You don't even have to get them on a Zoom. Just email them. Hey, thanks. I appreciate that. Here's a cup of coffee on me. People are just grateful for anything that reciprocates right now.
Well, by the way, Brad, who is working behind the scenes on our session now, said that all of the emails for you 3 panelists will be available at the end. So guests, note that you'll have them. And I will be emailing Dan, Ashford, and Ken asking you what are the top 2 or 3 sources where you get your information. So be ready for that email from me. So Ashford, Steve also had a follow-on question related to liquidity, which I think ties back to what you were going to, which you referenced earlier that you were going to get to. But so he wants you to elaborate more on how to achieve good liquidity.
Yes, and thanks for that question. It does segue in nicely to what I wanted to talk about. And there's two parts to this answer. And one of the things I see in the small to medium-sized business categories, there's a lot of attention paid to the income statement. How much money are we making? What's our gross profit? What's our EBITDA? But one of the things that you have to pay attention to, especially in times of crisis or liquidity, is the balance sheet. And so if you've got assets and you've got liabilities, and those assets have different levels of liquidity. Cash is instantly available. Accounts receivable, depending on how you sell, can be instantly available or take a long time to collect. I've got one client who collects at the point of sale, so there's no receivables. It turns instantly into cash. I've got another client who sells a very expensive product that they finance, and they collect those receivables over 5 years. Very different cash flow model. You've got inventory. Some inventory sells quickly. Some inventory takes a long time to sell. Some of it is obsolete. Then you've got different levels of liquidity to pay your liabilities. So on the liability side of the balance sheet, you've got your current payables, and it may be trade payables to vendors. It could be rent. And as everybody knows right now, rent is not always paid currently. There are a lot of negotiations going on between tenants and landlords that affect that. Like, for example, I've got one client whose half of their accounts payable is their rent, which they haven't paid since April. Half of that's probably not going to be paid. And then you've got current maturities of long-term liabilities. You may have a bank loan that's coming due in this next year, or you may have a substantial part of your loan. You've got to compare that back to your pool of liquidity on the asset side. So there's a whole half of the equation, and a lot of times a lot of business owners don't pay attention is work that balance sheet. And one of the things that also has come to the forefront during this time is access to capital. One of the things that was surprising was that during the PPP loan process, is how quickly a lot of the community banks, which a lot of times are just forgotten in a lot of the business community, how quickly they were able to process the PPP loans and get those into the hands of businesses, where some of the big banks, one in particular that I won't name, stumbled around for a long period of time. And so it became apparent to several of my clients that they needed to expand their business banking relations, not only from some of the bigger banks to some of the community banks, just to diversify their access to capital. And in this day and time, especially as the pandemic has progressed, there's lots of different access to capital from a lot of different providers. It holds different terms, different methods of repayment, different advantages and disadvantages. So really that's one of the things I wanted to bring to the attention of everybody is work your balance sheet.
So Steve, did you get what you were looking for in that question?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay, fantastic. Good, excellent. So I'm going to swing back around to Dan. Dan, you mentioned some of the buckets of where you saw these, I guess, legal issues coming. What about liability? How can businesses begin to address any liability or potential liability concerns that they may have coming out of the pandemic?
Thanks, Ed. And actually, before I answer that question, I wanted to share. So this is where we asked the question about whether employers can actually require employees to get the vaccine. I have an answer for this already.
Oh, great! There we go.
So our firm has a labor and employment blog that published, and obviously has been publishing a lot over the past 6 to 8 months about employee-related issues with COVID. And so this is a blog that describes kind of some of the legal parameters of that. And the answer is employers can require employees to get vaccines as a condition of employment, but they have to do so within the strictures of kind of both some certain OSHA requirements as well as ADA requirements. If an employee believes, for instance, that he or she is potentially more susceptible to having an adverse reaction to the vaccine, and so there's some issues there. But as a broad answer to the question, the answer is yes, they can force employees to get vaccines. So obviously visit that. Visit that blog if you guys have any other questions or if you want to dive more into that specific question. But specifically, I think that when it comes to liability issues going forward, I think there's obviously two different categories. There's internal liability, which has to do with, again, employee related issues. And so again, it's taking care regarding COVID exposure. Also, again, certain ADA requirements related to that. But then, really primarily what I focus on in my practice is third party exposure, whether that's, again, contract disputes with partners or customers, suppliers, things like that. And I think the biggest, so first off, you have, and even within that, you have contractual liability versus, tort liability or someone making a claim against the company. So let's start with the tort liability aspect. Number one, I think insurance, a broad insurance portfolio is obviously important for any company. And I think it's even more important in this environment where margins are even thinner. Parties can't just by themselves manage litigation risk in the same way. Because I know a lot of bigger companies do a lot of self-insured programs where they actually just say, hey, we're so big, yeah, we deal with a lot of litigation, but we can cover at least $10 million worth of litigation expenses and claims that are going to come in before another insurance policy kind of comes in on the back end if there's a massive claim, right? Most companies, obviously that I work with, are more small to middle market companies. They don't have that ability. So I think having, again, an insurance program that kind of covers potential third party claims. One thing to obviously consider, and I will say I don't have the exact answer to this, but I know it's something that's going to come up and has come up with in other contexts. A lot of insurance policies, whether it's if you have a commercial general liability policy or obviously employment related issues as well. A lot of those insurance policies actually have virus exclusions, obviously kind of talking about COVID. And so, of course, it's kind of like you can't buy fire insurance after your home's already on fire. A lot of insurance companies are not really, agreeing to new policies without paying a massive premium for that. So if there's any virus related, aspect of your business where either, customers could be more exposed to COVID who are coming into your business, or you're an event company and you're having a lot of people in your, either in your facility or you're hosting a lot of people, there's some exposure there. And so I think that an insurance program could be helpful. The other aspect from a general litigation perspective, which I'm seeing in my business, is impacting every single day of my life for the past 6 months, is all the courts are closed. Yeah. And so one thing to also keep in mind when it comes to liability and when it comes to litigation risk generally for businesses is that things are not moving as quickly. And listen, even before the pandemic, they did not move very quickly in the courts. But so whereas before the pandemic, the average time for a case from inception through trial was approximately 18 months. That was kind of, I'd say that was an average, but maybe not even the median, but that's an average. Now that is at least 2 years from inception to trial. And so as people are evaluating kind of potential liability issues, one thing that actually I'm telling clients who are in a position where, because I obviously represent both sides. I represent, clients who are actually trying to assert a claim because they feel like someone owes them money. But I also represent parties who, a claim has been made against them. And oftentimes I advise clients where a claim has been made against them, where they may owe money. I hate to say this, but there's a lot of flexibility right now, because at the end of the day, if you were to try to just say, put your foot down and say, I'm not paying anything, I have no liability, or, hey, we're just not going to pay, we can't pay. Well, then again, what's the other side thinking? They're thinking, well, the only way to enforce that is now ordinarily to file suit. And now you're looking at a 2-year runway before you actually get to even the possibility of recovery. And so what I normally use we use that as a way of honestly negotiating either workouts, settlements, or otherwise, just advising the client to say, hey, you can actually use this cash. They otherwise, and maybe in good economies, either you'd write off or you just, you pay out a claim just to make it go away. Here, because cash is so important, as Ashford was saying regarding liquidity, I think that businesses are realizing, hey, it's actually better in a lot of ways for us to kind of, play this hand and hold on to our cash longer, even if, even if there's even if the other side does have a claim. I think at the end of the day, we obviously I want to do the right thing. I want to make sure that, no one's screwing anybody over. But at the same time, I think that's a business strategy that we can use and our clients can use going forward to just understanding the litigation environment we're currently in.
Okay. Dan, I have another question for you from Steve about best practices for remote workers, especially if there's anything related to international remote workers, just when it comes into the legal box.
Yeah, Steve, you're coming up with great questions. Thank you for that. The thing that I would say for, and maybe I have to clarify, but also, are you asking from an employee standpoint or from an employer standpoint? Because I'll tell you from a business standpoint, if we're talking about management, kind of the employer perspective and trying to implement best practices. Okay, yeah, thank you for the clarification. Yeah, one thing, like I said, I think you have to have file management systems, data privacy and IT related systems in place. Because inevitably, I every now and again will deal with a customer where I'm surprised at how sophisticated their business is. And then you actually go into, well, what were your practices involving how your employees managed files, right? Was it an online system or were they downloading documents to their desktop locally on their computer? And that exposes, that's just a massive litigation risk. And obviously, it depends on the severity of the issue and how, the significance of the materials that are being saved. But at the end of the day, that to me is, I think, and obviously I'm a litigator, that to me is a massive risk that employers face when their employees are at home and when they feel like, again, they're at home. Well, it's their home computer. They can just, put things on their computer without saving it to either a cloud system or other file management system. So that's an example. I would also say, best practices for international remote workers. I think honestly, I think from a legal perspective with international related issues, I think you have to make sure that there are sufficient safeguards, again, regarding data privacy, but also involving, I would say you have to make sure that so an example of this, actually, I have a client who is involved in it's a technology company. They're involved in a business dispute because of COVID, their partner who they've contracted with to build this product for an end user and customer, their partner who was, specifically part of this deal to provide these specific services, used international workers because they were trying to cut costs rather than using domestic workers. And so at the end of the day, they just didn't perform. And so that created additional risk now, because now my client is now looking at this other partner and saying, well, you were required to provide this piece of the puzzle that you now are not providing. And so now we have a dispute on our hands over, it's going to be over $2 million. And so at the end of the day, that's, specifically, I think international workers, again, are perfectly fine. But I think that there are certain, considerations you have to take into account when analyzing how to incorporate those workers. If you haven't already, maybe you have a business that has international workers that are already incorporated into your business operations. But anybody who's thinking about changing their current employee array to include international help, I think that's going to be, that presents certain unique challenges, not only to, again, that's that employee-employer relationship, but also to your existing projects you need to work on.
So Ashford, how does strategic planning or planning in general, do you think, need to change in the era of COVID? You're on mute. You're on mute, Ashford. Yeah.
This is a question that we could spend several hours on, but really, it is a function of looking at resource allocation, where you're putting your money. There are businesses right now that have not been affected. They're steady state businesses and they're going to keep on. There are other businesses that are expanding current markets. There are other businesses that are their focus is just harvesting. The businesses like for example, Lysol and Clorox, they're harvesting right now. They've got a big expanded market. They're pulling down huge amounts of cash. And there's also businesses that their focus is building and expanding future markets. And so given the fact that we're in a pivot point in this economy, there's really 4 different places in a corporation right now where you can allocate your resources. One is current operations. You're funding your current infrastructure and you're building that out. You're also investing in your people, your staff, upgrading expertise, making sure you've got the right people in the right seats. A lot of companies now are funding a lot of innovation and R&D to build their future markets or future products. And then the fourth one again is liquidity. So you're investing in current operations, people, innovation, and R&D for future markets and liquidity. So the strategic planning process needs to make sure you've got the right resource allocation to optimize where you're investing. And one of the things that is really important in this is that you do different types, like your resources are going to be money or capital investment. It's going to be just the focus of your company in terms of management, operating teams, or external expertise. And so as companies navigate through this, whether they are thriving, whether they are just status quo, whether they're dealing with weakening economics or in their worst case scenario, strategic planning needs to focus more now on resource allocation than ever before.
Very good.
I have something to add on to that, if from a marketing perspective, that really dovetails nicely into what Ashford said. Is for most of our clients that we're doing marketing, PR, and any kind of promotional planning for, because there's a lot of unknowns, right? We don't know if trade shows are coming back. We don't know if conferences are coming back, but you need to market. So you almost need a scenario. Scenario A is baseline. We have to do these things. We're committed to it. It's good, better, best. It's almost like you're going to buy that hot water heater at Home Depot and you're like, that one's going to go out after 10 years and flood my house. And that one's going to go 22 years. So I always go 22 for that reason. But what you need to do is say good, better, best. If we don't, and that's how our prospects, our clients are going to their financial planning and asking for their budgets, is to say, at a minimum, we need this. And if things are good and hopping, we'd like to do this, so that it's incremental, they're phased. You can almost color code it to see these things are baseline, these things are nice to have and would take us to a more competitive advantage. And this is going to really put us above everybody. So going back to what I said earlier about not sitting back and waiting or doing minimal, you almost have to show and demonstrate what those 3 levels look like visually for your clients to say, okay, that's worth the investment. So if people aren't thinking about this, and look, the difference between good, better, and best could be we get that vaccine in place, everybody starts taking it, it's taken off. That way you don't have to figure out how to top up your plan because things have improved, or scale it back because they haven't. You already have scenarios in place. And it sounds like a lot of work, but the reality is our clients always want to know what are all the things we could do anyway. So we're just taking that and working back and scaling down to something that we consider this is the bare minimum you need to do if you want to be competitive and sell. I hope that helps.
Fantastic. So I think we have about, this goes to 12:25. So we have another 15 minutes. Let's put, I just think, hey, TJ, how about, do you have a question you might want to ask?
I don't think.
Okay, very good. I just got to go around. Let's see on my screen here. Steve, you have another one you might want to ask?
I'm out of questions for now. I was typing in to say thank you.
So,
Hey,
There
Steve's contributed a lot here. I think we should give him
well,
credit already.
How about, I have a question from Valerie, which was touched on a little bit by Dan earlier, but so the question is, Dan, are you finding people more willing to negotiate right now because the court system is tied up? Know what I heard you say, maybe kind of keeping tight on your money there, but what are you seeing? In fact, I'll ask all of our panelists that same question.
Yeah, the answer is unquestionably yes. I've actually handled 3 cases, which ordinarily would probably go through at least one of the processes of litigation is discovery, where we're actually exchanging, requests and documents and going through that process. And that's where a lot of people, it's an expensive and it's a laborious process to go through. But to avoid that, I've had literally 3 cases in the past 2 months that ordinarily would have gone fully through the discovery process, where the parties agreed to do an early mediation, and we have effectively gotten the case resolved in all 3 cases. So the answer is yes, people are definitely more willing to negotiate. I think that, one of the interesting aspects of this is that, so I would have thought, and I think most people would have thought, that in this current environment, a lot of companies would be filing for bankruptcy and we'd be going through a lot of that. And there was an uptick in bankruptcy filings, not too long after COVID hit in March and April. However, what's really interesting is if you actually analyze the numbers according to the U.S. courts and the business bankruptcies, not individual bankruptcies, but business bankruptcies, those numbers year to date are actually lower than they were in 2019. And so it's interesting to kind of see how businesses are kind of holding off right now on maybe filing a Chapter 11, start to reorganize, or otherwise trying to kind of look at potential. That's obviously a last resort, right? But they're trying to kind of hold on. And so in that vein, I think parties are really willing to negotiate and work things out rather than taking steps that ultimately are going to lead to again, a very expensive process like litigation, or ultimately are just going to hurt their business long term. And so I think, and obviously I want to hear if my co-panelists here, Ken and Ashford, have similar experiences, but generally, like I said, I think that parties are more willing to negotiate over everything now, and that obviously includes potential litigation claims.
So Dan, a quick question for you on the SBRA, that bankruptcy act that was enacted at the early part of this year that helps business owners retain equity, in businesses that declare bankruptcy. It was that special provision that was written into the Bankruptcy Act, and it's scheduled to expire, I think, in February of next year. But I've been a little surprised that more businesses have not taken advantage of that, given the fact that it's a 1 year, duration on this. Is it the fact that maybe not many business people know about that? Or I've been a little surprised about that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I actually do a little bit of bankruptcy litigation as well, if they need a litigator to come in and help resolve some issues. But no, I think a lot of it's education. People don't know about that provision. The other aspect is that we have to acknowledge there's a pride aspect to this. There's a pride aspect. There's a pride aspect to filing bankruptcy, even if it can be advantageous for your business in terms of reorganizing debt and working things out, that businesses don't ever really want to talk about. And by the way, it is an expensive process too. So it's also something that, people think it's like, oh, I just declare bankruptcy and everything goes away. No, it actually, people pay lawyers and financial, accountants and advisors a lot of money to
Exactly.
And it's, those are important roles we have to play in that process. But no, I think that's probably the answer. It's a combination of lack of knowledge of the system and familiarity with the system, as well as, I think, a pride issue.
One of the things that we talked about in our own internal management discussions on this was, like you say, the pride issue and approaching, we have a lot of CEOs who've created their businesses in this, from ground up. And as you said, declaring bankruptcy is something that is seen as a mark of shame. However, in a pandemic, this pandemic has wiped out businesses through no fault of their own. It wasn't an error in management judgment. It wasn't that they were overextended. It's just they got caught in the simultaneous collapse of supply and demand. And so we're working with our group to say this is not something that has shame attached. This is a global pandemic, and to try to work through that. There are some real advantages for companies that are struggling right now if they use the SBRI provisions to work through this.
Well, one other aspect of this as well, and again, my hope is that anybody participating in this, breakout is not ever going to face this. But if one thing that I find that's interesting is that a lot of business owners, and this is even sophisticated businesses, obviously most businesses nowadays that I deal with, and I think a lot of us deal with, are LLCs, limited liability companies. And so they're not quite as formal as a traditional corporation in a lot of ways. But inevitably, what's interesting is a lot of these companies, as they are experiencing trouble that maybe does force them to shut down, and obviously they don't maybe have the assets, or they don't have the liabilities that require a bankruptcy, they just kind of shut down, and they just, and sometimes you just open up a new LLC and you move on. One thing that I would really advise, and because I do a lot of litigation over these business arrangements and how companies are wound down, make sure to wind up your LLC. Make sure to wind up your business if and when it gets to that point. I hope nobody ever does that. But most people, who are involved in a business that is not ultimately successful, they're going to still work. And if they're an entrepreneur and they're looking for, new business opportunities, they're going to expand into a new business. And what I hate to see is when a former LLC, while now it's hard to pierce the veil to actually get past the LLC to get to the owner, I get that. But inevitably there are problems that can come up with having kind of a defunct LLC that's still on the books, that's still technically an active LLC. I mean, active in the sense it hasn't been properly wound up, that I can see it. It even includes fraudulent transfer issues. So by taking assets from a clearly failing business that is about to go out of business, you have a certain amount of cash, you have some receivables, you have some even office furniture. I know that sounds crazy. And what they do is an entrepreneur will take that. They say, well, the business is out of business, we're not going to operate anymore. And they'll just take those things and move them into a new LLC and start working with the new business. That can be a fraudulent transfer if the old LLC has creditors who, have at least some entitlement to the assets of the company. And so those are the kinds of things that can cause problems for entrepreneurs as they kind of jump between different businesses. And so as we see additional business failures come up, and again, my hope is that nobody has to deal with that, but to the extent that happens, make sure to wind up the LLC correctly so that you avoid any future liability headaches in a new endeavor you may be taking.
Got it.
We have a question for Ken, but before, Andy had a question that's to me, but not in the chat box. I know Dan doesn't specialize in labor, but how great is the legal risk from terminating employees in this environment, specifically where the performance is related terminations rather than economic related reductions in force?
I do have experience with this, both in my practice, but also my wife is actually an HR manager for one of the big four accounting firms, and she's been very active in this environment, unfortunately. The general answer to that question, obviously it depends on the individual circumstances, is that it is not difficult to terminate employees right now. Because you do have multiple bases to do that. It's not just hey, everything is great, and therefore you have to, really show a performance issue. There are a variety of ways in which employers can make those really difficult decisions that I think are justifiable and that really don't expose the employer to a lot of potential liability. To me, the biggest concern to look back on is just making sure, labor law in the United States has a lot of protected classes. So you have to make sure that those decisions are vetted by somebody who has experience with understanding what those classes are, what the implications are, and just also making sure that you look at the employee's record and that it's properly documented. Because if you have an employee who has had no problems at all, no performance metrics or reviews that show poor performance or low performance, and you decide to terminate them, those are the situations in which you get potential wrongful termination lawsuits, discrimination lawsuits. So it's all about documentation and kind of backing up and reinforcing whatever decision you ultimately decide to make.
Ken, can you see the question in the box, or do you want me to state it?
Yeah, that's I can see it. That's a difficult one because there's so many variables involved, and it really is determined by the vertical industry you're in, how good your website is, organically speaking. So augmenting that with some paid on top of a well-performing website. I'd really like to have a conversation offline and find out where you're at, what's been working, looking at a few competitors and seeing what kind of, it's all relative is what I'm saying. And so there's no one answer. That's a really good question. And it's the way you should be thinking. So do you include YouTube? Yes. If your clients need validation to see a solution, in action, yes, because that will lead to sales. So I'd like to have a talk with you about what space you're in, look at what your competitors are doing, and then come back. And I'll do all that. As consulting, just talk to you about it. And then you can figure out what you need to do moving forward. I either need to get a freelancer, or when I hear tighter budget, my goal is always to put you in line with somebody that's going to get you the best bang for your buck. And it may not be a full service agency like ours. It might be somebody that is, very qualified, but has less overhead. So happy to have a discussion offline with you and ask you about 10 questions so I can come back with what my best recommendation is on moving forward. I hope that helps.
Hey, Ed, I actually, if we don't have another question, I have a question for Ashford. Is that all right?
Yep, you bet.
Ashford, I have a question. We kind of follow us up on some of the things we kind of were touching on. Have you seen in your experience with your clients, a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business owners actually may own different businesses, right? They may own or one or more. And as part of that, as part of liquidity concerns, are you seeing them try to either, share resources and try to otherwise, from a financial perspective and a business perspective, utilize those multiple businesses? And what are the challenges maybe associated with that if you have seen it?
That's a great question. And you're right. It goes back to what you talked about. I'm seeing the ones with multiple entities shift resources back and forth depending on which entity needs liquidity. Some entities naturally hold a lot of liquidity, others don't. So they're shifting back and forth, but they're also, as their teams get smaller, if they have to lay off people, they're starting to share more expertise between entities if they have different staffs. Like for example, the accounting staff may be taking on more and more processing activity for the other entities, or the sales and marketing folks may be starting to work on common points of inflection between the entities. So there's a lot more resource sharing and a lot more liquidity sharing.
Well, I would note as part of that, if companies are starting to do that, they really need to think through the legal implications of that, because the more and more you share those resources, the more that actually the law may deem them to be one enterprise. And so that creates potential liability concerns for both entities. The other thing I will say is that oftentimes those relationships need to be documented. So for instance, if there is a transfer of money, a lot of business owners clients I've dealt with before, they'll just be like, well, yeah, the company needed $100,000. So I transferred $100,000 from company A into company B. And you're like, yeah, but there has to be some of the documents that, not just a wire transfer confirmation, there has to be some reason why that was, because these are the biggest challenge that I have with entrepreneurs, people who have their hands in a lot of different companies, is understanding the fundamental concept that each individual entity is effectively its own person. I mean, I want to get controversial with Citizens United, but it is its own entity with its own legal rights. And so when you start mixing those, it gets really challenging. And so I want to make sure we tell everyone to kind of be careful of that. And if you need advice, obviously, Ashford or even myself from the legal perspective can provide that.
Well, I want to thank everyone. It is 12:25. I believe it's time for us to break, and we have 5 minutes until we go hear from our Dallas Mavericks general manager and the chief marketing officer of the Texas Legends. So thank you, Dan, Ashford, and Ken. Thank you for all those who provided some questions to our great panelists, and we'll hopefully see everybody in about 5 minutes. Take care.